Hey Science Nines, it's Manchak here, and I am going to run you guys through your next concept in Unit C. So we are moving on to Concept C5, and what I've got on here is just a quick rundown to remind myself of a couple of things to tell you guys as we move ahead here. So concept C5 is sort of all about looking at hazardous materials both in the environment and at home, and how we can work on disposing those and what are some of the hazards associated with them. So like everything in this unit, we're just digging a little bit deeper into this idea of pollutants and hazardous materials and other things like that. I just wanted to bring this up here just to run through with you guys sort of what you're up against when it comes for this concept. This is a really short concept. It should not take me very long to go through it with you, and it should not take you very long to go through as well. This will be posted in the Google Classroom as well, where the video is posted, so you'll be able to find out the textbook pages on there as well in your textbook if you want to use that as a resource other than your notes as well. There are a couple of videos I'm going to put in. One of them will be up later in the week. It's a quick lesson that I'm going to do actually and record on peregrine falcons. Something that I actually usually present to the outdoor education class in high school, but I thought you guys might be interested because it links into the concept of biomagnification, which is what we are going to be talking about early on in this concept. Then a couple of videos on landfills, or one on landfills and why they're so important, and then just a really brief video on how to dispose of hazardous household waste. And then a little tiny bit of formative work just coming in the form of some questions out of the textbook. No big worksheet for this this unit, or this concept, pardon me. And then I will post up later this week a practice quiz for you on the Google Classroom, and then you'll be able to jump into your summative quiz after I've given you feedback on the practice quiz, the formative quiz. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to pop into the concept, and we are going to get started on it here. So I'm going to move my video so I can hit the present button. Oh darn. And then I have to sort of jump back here. My apologies, quick flash of my daughter there, or looking at her beautiful face, and then moving on. So these are for this concept, these are the outcomes that we're covering out of the program of studies, and they're kind of a little bit all over the case, but the big ones I'm going to point out here. We're going to talk about biomagnification in here. We're going to evaluate methods used to transport, store, and dispose of hazardous household chemicals. We'll investigate potential risks resulting from consumer practices, so we'll focus a lot on us as consumers, as well as industrial processes and some of the ideas associated with that. We'll identify and evaluate information and evidence related to an issue in which environmental chemistry plays a role. So I'm going to talk about peregrine falcons because I think that was a major learning experience for us and gives you guys an idea of a success story, which I think is really kind of cool. And then we'll talk a little bit about the biological impacts of hazardous chemicals and look at things like domestic waste, paints, other things. And one of the videos actually gets into talking about how to dispose of that stuff. So, hazardous chemicals affecting living things, or they affect living things. Chemicals can accumulate in living organisms, and the increased concentrations mean that chemicals can remain in the environment for long periods of time. What we can mean by that is not only do these wastes accumulate in organisms, and that can actually affect that organisms or others that eat that organism, but also when those organisms die that might have lots of those wastes inside them, or harmful pollutants inside them, they can end up causing significant harm as well. So this poses major problems whenever hazardous chemicals are released into the environment, and we need to consider not only what happens to us, but also the ecosystems that it can affect. And I think that's the tricky one for a lot of us, is we don't spend much time out in those ecosystems, but when bad things do start to happen, we see impacts in those ecosystems, and we have to remember that those ecosystems are what support life on Earth. And if we start to destroy or cause harm to too many ecosystems, it can affect our fresh water, it can affect our food sources, and other things that have a major impact on us. So something to really pay attention to. And so the concept that's associated particularly with this increased concentrations in living organisms is the concept of biomagnification or bioaccumulation. And this is simply the increase in concentration of a chemical or element as it moves up the food chain. And so what I've got here is a little simple diagram that sort of shows how a pesticide could biomagnify as it moves up a food chain. Remember, a food chain is all about what organism eats other organisms within a particular ecosystem. And a food chain is a very simple way to represent who eats who in an ecosystem. And so this is an aquatic ecosystem, more or less, where we have a pesticide that maybe has been sprayed nearby that aquatic ecosystem. And what ends up happening is that pesticide in some way gets inside of the water and gets absorbed by zooplankton, which are really tiny, almost microscopic, in many cases, organisms that live inside the water. And small fish eat those zooplankton, so it might be minnows or other fish like that, or even immature versions of other fish like perch or walleye or something along those lines. And these little numbers in here indicate how much pesticide in parts per million each of these each individual organism might get in it. So zooplankton will have tiny amounts, probably not enough to do anything to those organisms. Small fish will still have tiny amounts of them. Large fish will have larger amounts, and when we get up to the top, those birds, those fish-eating birds like osprey or bald eagles sitting at the very top of that food chain, they'll have quite a lot, 25 parts per million of that pesticide. How this magnifies as it moves up the food chain is that the zooplankton might only get 1 or 2 particles of the pesticide in them. But those small fish are going to eat many, many, many zooplankton. And so they're going to get many, many, many particles in them. And then a large fish is going to eat several small fish. And it's going to get all of the chemicals that the small fish had in it. And just as the small fish got all of the chemicals that in the zooplankton that it ate. And then when an eagle comes along or an osprey and eats one of these large fish, and it's probably going to eat several large fish, then what happens is that eagle gets all of the chemicals that had accumulated in the large fish, which had accumulated in the small fish, which had accumulated in the zooplankton. And usually what happens is there's not much effect on the organisms way down here, but we can see major effects in the individuals or the organisms way at the top of the food chain. And these pesticides or chemicals can be things like simple pesticides that we'd use in our fields or to control insects, or it could be heavy metals or other organic compounds, and they can all biomagnify in an ecosystem. So that's a really important concept to have a look at for this concept here, and that's biomagnification. I'd like you guys to take a moment at some point, maybe after you've run through this video, or if you're bored already and want to hit pause, go to pages 250 through 252 of your textbook and read through this section on the Exxon Valdez, which was an oil spill that happened in 1989, so a long time ago, 30 years ago. And give it a good read. It says we'll discuss shortly. Well, we're not going to discuss that, but I'd like you guys, unless you want to discuss it amongst yourself, but I'd like you to take the time to read through it and get a good understanding of what happened with the Exxon Valdez and why it was significant. So the other thing that's going to happen is I'll present another case study to you, and that is on peregrine falcons. And I'm going to pull information and do another video associated with something that I do in the Introduction to Wildlife module I offer in outdoor education for students. So I'll run through that, and you can have a look at that when it's up later on in the week. I'm not going to pull anything specific for your concept quiz out of the Peregrine Falcon stuff, but it's a good example of a couple of things. It's a good example of biomagnification and how that works. And it's also a good example of what we can do if we understand the kinds of chemicals that we're putting into the environment. And it shows us the impacts if we're not careful, and then what we can do if we realize our mistake. And it's a good news story, something that's very positive that we can point to. And what's really cool about it is that it has a very local connection to the area around Riley and Beaver County. So I will leave that for you to click on in the Google Classroom under resources later on. So at this point, I think it'd be a good opportunity for you to sort of hit pause and do these practice questions on page 252. There's only 4 of them for you to have a look at. Have a look at them, maybe discuss them with each other if you can online, and then when you're ready, hit play again and jump into the next section. So the last bit that we're going to talk about here is a close look at hazardous household chemicals. And these are the chemicals, obviously, that we're going to use around our homes, in our yards, the things that you're going to encounter on a relatively regular basis, and things that you should be aware of. Now, I know back in elementary school, you've gone and done a bunch of work with this, and you sort of have an idea of the safety symbols that are on these different chemicals that you find in your household. But it's worthwhile to talk about it now in the context of what we've been covering in this unit so far. So some of the chemicals that we're talking about are household cleaners, personal hygiene products. So, household cleaners like bleach or ammonia, or even, Windex or something along those lines. Personal hygiene products could be everything from, hairsprays to gels to creams to whatever products, maybe hair care products or something along those lines. Hair care is in dyeing and those kinds of things. Pet care products we should pay attention to. Paint and paint products, and paint is a big one to pay attention to. And one of the videos that I'll use as a resource later on explains a little bit more about paints. So pay attention for that. Pesticides and fertilizers you should pay attention to as well. These are the ones that we use in our gardens. But also maybe if you're on a farm, some of the pesticides and fertilizers you might use out on the farm. And then automotive fluids, things like oil, antifreeze, gas line antifreeze, whatever it might be, those are also hazardous household chemicals. And I'm sure we're missing other things. I'm sure if you went through and had a look, underneath the sink in the kitchen, or, in your laundry room where you might store stuff, you might find other things that would be considered hazardous. Improper storage, transport, and disposal of these products, first off, can contribute to harming us individually if we don't handle them properly. So they can contribute to burns, maybe if the chemical that you're dealing with is acidic or basic. We know acidic and basic compounds can be corrosive, and so that can harm us. Some of these things might contain chemicals that could cause heart problems or kidney failure. If we inhale them, they could cause respiratory problems. Some of them are, even if they're particularly nasty, they could cause cancer. They could cause the mutation of certain cells and leading to cancer. We could even experience death if they were consumed. And so you want to watch out for these hazardous household warning symbols that are existent on compounds. And I'm sure you've seen them before on those bottles, and you flip it over and it's got a skull and crossbones on it, or it's got a little explosion symbol, and you're watching out for things like toxic, warning, caution, and that's the shapes. If you remember, toxic would be the sort of stop sign shape, the octagonal shape. Warning is a triangle, no, is a square, and caution is I might have this wrong, guys, and caution is a triangle. And then they come in different sort of categories like flammable, corrosive, reactive, etc., etc. Whenever you're dealing with one of those chemicals, you need to think about where you're storing it, how you're transporting it, and then when you're done with it, what you're going to do to dispose of it. There are government regulations that exist that are designed to protect consumers and reduce the risk associated with these chemicals. And so these regulations reflect our most current scientific research done on the products and how they might interact with other products. As new research comes to light, government regulations are changed to reflect our new understanding. And this is often the case in a lot of things like pesticides, where we think, oh, we found the pesticide that is going to do the best work for us, but maybe it hasn't been researched quite well enough, and lo and behold, that pesticide actually ends up doing more harm than we expected. And so we have to wheel back a little bit and change our regulations and make sure that we release that chemical in a safe way and that people are educated on what to do with that chemical. So these regulations exist to protect us when we're storing, transporting, using, and disposing of these dangerous chemicals. So again, it's really important for us to think about not only how to be safe when we're using the chemicals, but also how to store them. If we're taking them from point A to point B, what's the safe way to do that? And then when we're done with those chemicals, what are we going to do with them? So you're already familiar with WHMIS, right? And it's actually been updated recently, and the WHMIS is something that is recognized worldwide as a set of standards for how to handle workplace hazardous materials. And a lot of those workplace hazardous materials can be found in homes as well. The other thing that we can find for most products that are harmful, if not all products, is what's called a material safety data sheet, which you've probably heard of before. And these are information sheets that can be the best place to find them is to type in whatever chemical and then MSDS in Google, and you'll find access to a whole bunch of these different types of chemicals. So let me sort of show you that. We'll go into Google here and I will do, I don't know, hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide MSDS, right? Type it in, and then you've got your material safety data sheet for, now this is 35% hydrogen peroxide. That's the stuff that they use in hair salons to bleach hair, which is much nastier than the hydrogen peroxide down here, which is 3%. So you could click on one of these and you can have a look at the material safety data sheet for it. And you can scroll your way through and it tells you things like WHMIS symbols, which you can see on here. So it's oxidizing, it can be corrosive, it is an irritant, and then some other information. It's dangerous. Here's some hazard statements, some precaution statements. It can go through other classifications, talks about first aid measures, gets into talking about firefighting, accidental release, handling and storage, right? These data sheets are excellent to be aware of. And as some of you are starting to move into the work world, you should be aware of this kind of stuff. And if you're working with chemicals that are harmful in a job or at home or on the farm or whatever it might be, you should be paying attention to what is hazardous about those materials, how they can harm you, and what you can do to keep yourself safe. Ignorance is not bliss when it comes to this. These things can be pretty nasty, and you want to be really, really careful when you're playing around with them, as part of a job or as part of something that you're doing around the house. So be aware. It's easy enough to look up an MSDS. It's easy enough to sort of work your way through it. It's written in relatively understandable language, and if it's not, if it's your job and you're not aware of the language, then it's up to your employer to tell you what you need to know about that chemical, and don't accept, oh, it's okay to worry about it. Okay, that's not acceptable. So anyway, I'll get down off my soapbox on that, and we'll jump back into the presentation here. I cannot click. Okay, I'm going to move myself down into the bottom left then. All right. So that's government regulations and things like MSDS. When new products are produced, the supplier must apply for approval to make it available to the consumer. And if they don't do so, then they are usually circumventing government regulations and they can get in trouble for those kinds of things. So the information about the product must include things like what is intended to be used for, what are the physical and chemical properties of the substance, what are active ingredients that we need to be aware of, what are the instructions for use, and what are safety precautions when you're using that. And then importantly, what are the health effects, environmental effects that might be associated with whatever chemical they're working with, what is the toxicity to humans, and what are the first aid instructions in case somebody ends up poisoned. So all of these things need to be considered when you come up with your newfangled pesticide or the new cleaner that cleans absolutely everything in the house. So something for all of us to consider. When we store chemicals at home, these are, I think, pretty common sense, but I want to run through them just really quickly, just in case. And I know as a new dad, well, not new, but we've got a daughter who's almost 3 years old now, and she's moving around the house and she's getting into cupboards. We, have gone through the house and made sure that our chemicals are safe, and that we are starting to teach her what to do with these chemicals, how to avoid them, those kinds of things. So first thing, keep them out of reach of children. So the lock them up or put them in a place where children can't access them. And as children get older, you need to find better places to put those products. Locking them up is probably the safest way to do it. If you've got a chemical that's in a container that is not in good condition, maybe consider putting it into a new container. Or if you're unable to do that, then put it in another container, like set it inside of another container, so that if the initial container fails for whatever reason, all of it will be collected. Generally, it's good to store chemicals in cool, dry, and well-ventilated places, because heat does a lot of stuff to chemicals. Dryness or wetness can react with chemicals, and well ventilated means that if it's releasing any sort of gas, it's just spreading out into the air and diffusing very quickly, and it's not going to be an issue for us. You never want to store flammables or gases in glass containers, because as if something flammable were to light on fire, it would build up pressure very rapidly inside that container, and then you've got a little grenade of glass exploding all over the place. Gases heat up when it gets warmer out, and so that increases the pressure. And again, if it explodes, then you're spreading glass all over the place if it does that. You're going to store different classifications of chemicals on separate shelves in separate locations, so you don't really want to store something acidic right beside something basic. I think at this point, if we were in my classroom, I would take you into the back, into the chemical room, and I'd show you that we've actually divided up, and there's, I think, about 7 different places where I'm storing chemicals. And it's not that I'm disorganized, it's that certain chemicals need to be stored in one spot, certain chemicals need to be stored in another spot, some chemicals need to be enclosed in a metal container, etc., etc. You want to keep anything that's an oxidizer away from flammables, because they can react and then you can end up with a big mess. You want to keep all chemicals upright. You want to store them in a proper place when they're not in use. You want to discard any old products that have, maybe have an expiry date on them or haven't been used in 30 years. You may want to get rid of those. And then you want to place any rusted or leaking containers inside a second container, and then dispose of both as when it's safe to do so. When you transport these goods, when a chemical is purchased and when it is disposed of, transportation issues are concerns for us. So you need to take care to ensure that the passengers are not at risk in your vehicle, and that includes the person that's driving. So from anything from spills to leaks to fumes or accidental handling. So if you're handling really nasty stuff, maybe it's best to do it in the box of a truck rather than in an enclosed, cab of the truck or in your vehicle. Make sure you place the product upright and secure in the trunk if you're in a car or the box of a truck. And when disposing of many products together, never mix them into one container. It's not all about let's pour all these chemicals in and see what happens, because you don't know what you're going to produce. Mixing bleach with certain other things can release chlorine gas, and chlorine gas is toxic and can cause death. So you want to try to keep them in their original containers with their original labels on. And then you're going to take them to a hazardous chemical disposal site. But before we get to that, remember never to pour hazardous chemicals down the drain or into the soil. We know this, that if you pour it down a drain, then it's getting into our wastewater supply, and then we have to try to pull it out of there. And if we got too much concentration of a hazardous chemical, our waste treatment plants are working overtime to try to deal with that. Our water treatment plants are working overtime to deal with that. You don't want to pour it out into the soil, especially if you live on a farm, because if that stuff starts to move through the soil, it could get down into the groundwater. That groundwater might be the groundwater you're pulling your well water from, and you could be poisoning your well water. You don't want to throw them into the garbage, because first off, it's hazardous to the people who are coming to dispose of your waste, but then it gets into a landfill, and who knows whatever other chemicals it's reacting with, and the problems that could be associated with that. And hazardous products may not be treated by the sewage treatment system or the septic system, and as a result they could be released into the soil or enter surface water and harm organisms downstream. So I just wanted to point these two out. I'm not going to really spend much time with them, but I don't know if Beaver County has something similar. I would imagine they do, but there are eco stations and eco service stations in both Edmonton and Strathcona County where you can get rid of these hazardous waste, and you literally bring the containers in, drop them off, and they handle disposing it in an environmentally conscious way. And so you can easily search these up on the internet and have a look at their websites and sort of talk and go through. And of course, I'm clicking on it now, and we're in the midst of COVID-19, so you're seeing that all of these places are closed. But they talk about where they're located and what you can do and what to do with commercial waste versus home waste and all of those kinds of things. So there's a couple of suggestions there for you. Solid waste garbage, basically you're just going to follow the guidelines that have been created to avoid toxics or hazardous products and prevent them from being placed into a sanitary landfill where they might burn or explode or escape as a leachate into the groundwater and eventually come back to haunt us. And page 258 of your textbook talks a little bit about that. I think at this point there's two videos. I think we're just about done. Yeah, we are done. So at this point, it'd be a good idea for you guys to have a look at page 259 and these 6 questions that are on the screen there, and they'll also be listed on the Google Classroom. And then there's also 2 videos I talked about earlier on in the lesson, one about landfills and the other one about disposal of household hazardous wastes and how to do that safely. So I would view those 2 videos. I would spend the time doing your practice questions out of your textbook. Have a look at those. If you have any questions about those questions, then go ahead and ask me for help on that. Fire me an email, track me down during office hours, something along those lines. And then once you feel comfortable with the content, jump on and do the practice quiz and see how that goes for you. The practice quiz will give you a bit better an idea of what kind of things I'm thinking are important. I think I dropped some hints along earlier on, biomagnification, and those are the kinds of things that I think are important. And then please, once you've done the practice quiz, give me a day to get back to you with some feedback before you start in on the summative assessment. Let me give you some feedback first when it's still formative. Don't just jump right into the summative assessment, because you could end up making the same mistake twice, and that doesn't make any sense to me. So I believe that is all I have for you for Concept C5. So take your time, work your way through things. And as always, if you have any questions, track me down via email or pop in for office hours, and we can have a conversation. Stay safe, stay away from each other. I know it's hard to say. And we will talk soon. See you later.